What if tomorrow morning every oil well on Earth suddenly stopped producing? Not because the oil had completely disappeared, not because every reserve had been exhausted, but because every active oil field, from the deserts of Saudi Arabia to the offshore platforms of the Gulf of Mexico and the shale fields of North America, simply stopped delivering new crude. At first glance, the world might appear surprisingly normal. Gas stations would not instantly run dry. Oil tankers already crossing the oceans would continue toward their destinations. Massive storage facilities containing strategic petroleum reserves, commercial stockpiles, and military fuel reserves would still hold millions of barrels of crude oil and refined fuels. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and thanks for watching. Refineries would continue operating for as long as supplies remained available. Yet, beneath that appearance of stability, one of the largest supply shocks in modern history would already be unfolding. Unlike many resources that can be stockpiled for years with little concern, oil is consumed continuously at an enormous rate. According to widely cited estimates from organizations such as the International Energy Agency and the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the world uses roughly 100 million barrels of oil every single day. Every hour, millions of barrels are transformed into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, marine fuel, heating oil, lubricants, plastics, chemicals, fertilizers, and thousands of other products that quietly support daily life. The global oil system functions less like a warehouse filled with endless supplies and more like a constantly moving river. New production replaces what is consumed almost as quickly as it disappears. If that river suddenly stopped flowing, the stored water would begin draining immediately. During the first few hours, financial markets would likely react long before ordinary people noticed any physical shortages. Oil futures could surge as traders attempted to estimate how long existing inventories might last. Governments would begin communicating with major energy producers and emergency agencies while trying to determine whether the interruption was temporary or permanent. Airlines, shipping companies, manufacturers, and logistics firms would immediately start reviewing fuel inventories and contingency plans. By the end of the first day, uncertainty itself could become one of the greatest threats. Modern economies depend heavily on confidence that supplies will continue arriving tomorrow. If businesses believed new oil production had permanently stopped, many would begin conserving fuel before shortages actually appeared. Some countries might restrict exports to protect domestic supplies. Others could release portions of their strategic petroleum reserves to stabilize markets and reduce panic. Within the first week, the effects would become increasingly visible. Oil prices would likely rise dramatically as governments, corporations, and traders competed for the same shrinking pool of available fuel. Nations with large emergency reserves would possess valuable time, while countries that rely heavily on imported oil could face immediate economic pressure. Fuel rationing would become a realistic possibility in some regions if supply disruptions appeared likely to continue. Even before storage tanks approached empty, the expectation of scarcity would begin changing decisions across the global economy. The remarkable reality is that civilization does not depend solely on how much oil exists beneath Earth's surface. It depends just as much on the uninterrupted flow of millions of barrels every single day. Once that flow stops, every hour becomes increasingly important, and every barrel becomes significantly more valuable. And this would only be the beginning. As the days pass, it becomes clear that the real problem is not simply that people may eventually run out of gasoline. Oil is the foundation of nearly every transportation system that keeps modern civilization moving. A single barrel of crude oil is refined into a variety of products, each designed for a specific purpose. Gasoline powers most passenger vehicles. Diesel fuels heavy trucks, buses, construction equipment, and agricultural machinery. Jet fuel keeps commercial aviation in the air, while heavy marine fuel moves the enormous cargo ships that transport roughly 80 to 90% of global trade by volume. Losing new oil production means every one of these fuels becomes a limited resource at the same time. The first visible cracks would likely appear on highways rather than at neighborhood gas stations. Long-distance trucking depends almost entirely on diesel fuel, and in many countries, stores receive fresh deliveries every day instead of maintaining large inventories. Supermarkets, pharmacies, factories, and warehouses operate on highly optimized supply chains designed for efficiency rather than long-term storage. If trucking companies begin conserving fuel or reducing operations because replacement supplies become uncertain, deliveries slow almost immediately. Shelves may not become empty overnight, but restocking becomes less predictable with every passing day. What appears to be a transportation problem quickly becomes a supply problem affecting nearly every product people buy. Aviation faces a similar challenge. Commercial aircraft cannot simply switch from jet fuel to another energy source within days or weeks. Modern airliners are engineered around aviation turbine fuel, and while sustainable aviation fuels are being developed and gradually introduced, current global production remains only a small fraction of total demand. Airlines confronted with uncertain fuel supplies would likely prioritize essential routes while reducing or canceling less critical flights. Airports that once handled thousands of departures each day could become noticeably quieter, not because aircraft disappeared, but because the fuel needed to operate them had become too valuable to use without careful planning. Across the oceans, the world's largest container ships would face the same reality. These massive vessels consume large quantities of marine fuel during long voyages, connecting manufacturers, ports, and consumers across continents. If shipping companies begin delaying departures to preserve fuel, or if importing nations restrict exports to protect domestic supplies, international trade slows dramatically. Electronics, clothing, machinery, medical equipment, and countless everyday goods spend part of their journey aboard these ships. When fewer vessels leave port, factories thousands of miles away may eventually find themselves waiting for parts that never arrive on schedule. The effects extend beyond transportation itself. Modern agriculture depends heavily on diesel-powered tractors, harvesters, irrigation pumps, and transport vehicles. Farmers often work within narrow planting and harvesting windows, where delays can reduce yields. Even if food exists in the fields, moving it efficiently from farms to processing plants and distribution centers requires reliable fuel. Emergency services are equally dependent. Ambulances, fire engines, police vehicles, disaster response teams, and military logistics all rely predominantly on liquid fuels because they provide high energy density, rapid refueling, and proven reliability under demanding conditions. Could electric vehicles solve the problem? They would certainly reduce dependence on gasoline for some passenger transportation, but replacing the global fleet overnight is not realistic. Manufacturing capacity, charging infrastructure, electrical grid expansion, battery production, and the replacement of millions of existing vehicles would require many years, even under highly ambitious scenarios. Heavy trucks, cargo ships, aircraft, and specialized machinery present even greater engineering challenges because current battery technology often cannot provide the combination of range, payload, and rapid refueling that these industries require. The result is a chain reaction that spreads far beyond transportation itself. Roads remain open, ports continue to exist, and airports still stand ready, yet the invisible flow that connects them begins to weaken. As fuel becomes increasingly scarce, the entire global supply chain starts to fracture, revealing how closely modern civilization depends on a resource that most people notice only when they fill their tank. By now, fuel shortages have begun disrupting transportation. But an even larger surprise is waiting just beneath the surface of everyday life. Most people associate oil with engines, highways, and gas stations, yet burning petroleum represents only part of its role in the modern world. Crude oil is also one of the most important raw materials used by the global chemical industry. Through refining and petrochemical processing, it is transformed into the building blocks for thousands of products that surround us every day, often so familiar that we no longer notice them. If new oil production suddenly stopped, the consequences would extend far beyond transportation and into nearly every room of every home. Start with plastic, perhaps the most recognizable petroleum-based material. Bottles, food containers, packaging films, storage boxes, toys, keyboards, appliance housings, medical syringes, and countless household items begin their lives as chemicals derived from crude oil or natural gas. Plastics have become so common because they are lightweight, durable, inexpensive, and adaptable to almost any shape. Without a continuous supply of petrochemical feedstocks, manufacturers would eventually struggle to replace the materials that modern production depends on. Existing inventories could temporarily delay shortages, but they could not support global demand indefinitely. The same hidden dependence appears in clothing. While cotton and wool are natural fibers, a large share of modern textiles contains synthetic materials such as polyester, nylon, acrylic, and elastane. Polyester alone has become one of the world's most widely used fabrics because it is strong, wrinkle-resistant, and inexpensive to manufacture. Many jackets, athletic uniforms, carpets, backpacks, and even blankets contain petroleum-derived fibers. A world without new oil production would not instantly eliminate these products, but manufacturing them at current scales would become increasingly difficult as petrochemical supplies declined. The influence of oil continues into industries that seem completely unrelated to energy. Cosmetics often rely on petroleum-derived ingredients that improve texture, stability, or moisture retention. Paints and protective coatings use petrochemical resins to increase durability and weather resistance. Many pharmaceuticals require petroleum-based chemicals during manufacturing, even though the active medicines themselves may originate from a wide range of sources. Agriculture also depends heavily on petrochemicals, particularly for producing synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, irrigation components, and durable plastic films used in farming. Feeding billions of people efficiently has become closely connected to these industrial materials. Electronics provide another unexpected example. Smartphones, computers, televisions, and household appliances contain petroleum-derived plastics, synthetic rubber, adhesives, insulating materials, and protective coatings. Electrical cables rely on plastic insulation to safely carry electricity through homes, hospitals, factories, and data centers. Even when a device appears to be mostly glass and metal, many of its internal components depend on petrochemical products that rarely attract attention because they are hidden beneath the surface. As supplies tighten, the chemical industry would likely face difficult decisions about which products deserve priority. Packaging materials could become scarcer, affecting food preservation and transportation. Plastic water bottles, electronic components, laboratory equipment, and medical materials might all compete for the same limited feedstocks. Hospitals, manufacturers, and governments would almost certainly receive higher priority than consumer goods. Yet even those sectors could experience growing pressure if the interruption continued. What makes this scenario so striking is not that humanity lacks alternatives for every petroleum product. Scientists and engineers are actively developing bio-based plastics, recycled materials, advanced composites, and renewable chemical feedstocks. However, replacing an industrial system built over more than a century cannot happen overnight. The deeper we look, the clearer the picture becomes. Oil is not simply a fuel that powers machines. It is one of the invisible foundations of modern manufacturing itself. Only when that foundation begins to disappear do we fully realize that petroleum exists not only beneath our feet, but almost everywhere we look. Faced with shrinking oil supplies, one question would dominate conversations around the world. Couldn't renewable energy simply replace it? At first, the answer might seem obvious. Solar panels generate electricity from sunlight. Wind turbines convert moving air into power. Hydroelectric dams produce reliable energy from flowing water. Nuclear reactors deliver enormous amounts of low-carbon electricity around the clock. Over the past 2 decades, these technologies have expanded rapidly, and together they are becoming an increasingly important part of the global energy system. But there is an important distinction that often disappears in public discussion. Most renewable energy technologies generate electricity. Oil, by contrast, is not only an energy source, but also a versatile chemical feedstock and an exceptionally energy-dense liquid fuel. Those are very different roles, and replacing one does not automatically replace the other. Electricity can power homes, factories, trains, and an increasing number of vehicles. But it cannot directly produce jet fuel, lubricating oils, plastics, synthetic rubber, or the countless petrochemicals that modern industries depend upon. These products require either petroleum itself or entirely different manufacturing pathways that are still developing at commercial scale. Simply adding more solar panels or wind farms would certainly reduce demand for fossil fuel-generated electricity, but it would not immediately solve shortages in aviation fuel, industrial chemicals, or high-performance lubricants used in machinery around the world. Electric vehicles demonstrate both the promise and the limits of electrification. Replacing gasoline-powered passenger cars with battery electric vehicles can significantly reduce oil consumption in road transport, especially for daily commuting. However, passenger cars represent only part of global oil demand. Heavy-duty trucks traveling thousands of kilometers, long-distance cargo ships crossing oceans, and commercial aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers require extremely high energy density. Current battery technology continues to improve, but for many of these applications, it often remains too heavy, too expensive, or insufficiently practical for long-range operation. Significant progress is being made, yet replacing these sectors on a global scale would require technological advances, massive infrastructure investment, and considerable time. Some of the most difficult industries extend beyond transportation altogether. Petrochemical manufacturing relies on hydrocarbons as raw materials rather than simply as fuel. Cement production requires extremely high temperatures that are challenging to provide with electricity alone in many existing facilities. Steel manufacturing is gradually exploring lower carbon methods, but much of today's production still depends on coal or other carbon-based processes. These sectors illustrate a broader reality. Decarbonizing electricity is only one part of transforming the entire industrial economy. Researchers and engineers are actively developing several alternatives that could reduce dependence on petroleum. Green hydrogen, produced using renewable electricity, has attracted attention as a possible fuel and industrial feedstock. Synthetic fuels, sometimes called e-fuels, combine hydrogen with captured carbon dioxide to create liquid fuels that can potentially power existing aircraft and ships. Biofuels derived from crops, agricultural waste, or algae may also contribute to future energy supplies in certain sectors. Each of these technologies shows promise, but each also faces important challenges. Production costs remain relatively high compared with conventional petroleum. Manufacturing capacity is still limited, and large-scale distribution systems are only beginning to develop. None of these obstacles make success impossible, but they do explain why rapid replacement would be extraordinarily difficult. The world is not running out of ideas. In many cases, The scientific foundations already exist, and progress continues every year. What remains is the enormous task of expanding these solutions until they can operate at the scale demanded by a civilization that consumes the equivalent of roughly 100 million barrels of oil every day. The challenge is not a lack of innovation. It is the gap between what is technically possible and what is currently available. In that sense, humanity may already have many of the answers, but it is not yet fully prepared to depend on them. After following the chain of events from the first silent oil well to disrupted transportation, strained industries, and the limits of today's alternatives, one final question remains. Could humanity actually survive without oil? The evidence suggests that the answer is almost certainly yes. Human beings lived for thousands of years before the petroleum age, and science continues to develop new technologies capable of replacing many of oil's functions. But surviving is not the same as preserving the world exactly as we know it today. If oil production suddenly ended tomorrow, civilization would not disappear overnight. Instead, it would likely enter one of the largest economic, industrial, and technological transitions in history, one measured not in months, but in decades. During that transition, nearly every aspect of daily life would have to adapt. Energy efficiency would become far more valuable than it is today. Governments and industries would likely accelerate efforts to reduce unnecessary fuel consumption, modernize electrical grids, expand renewable power generation, and redesign transportation systems around electricity wherever practical. Cities might invest more heavily in rail networks and public transit, while industries would search for manufacturing processes that require fewer petroleum-based materials. Recycling would evolve from an environmental goal into an economic necessity, as plastics, metals, batteries, and industrial materials became increasingly important sources of raw resources. Materials that are currently discarded could become essential components of future production. Scientific research would almost certainly accelerate as well. Engineers are already developing advanced batteries, recyclable polymers, bio-based plastics, synthetic fuels, and new industrial chemicals designed to reduce dependence on fossil resources. None of these technologies alone can replace everything oil provides today, but together, they represent a growing toolbox that did not exist a generation ago. History has repeatedly shown that societies often innovate fastest when confronted with severe constraints. Whether those innovations could be deployed quickly enough under an abrupt global oil shutdown remains uncertain. But the direction of technological development suggests that alternatives would continue expanding over time. Looking back, it becomes clear why oil has shaped the modern world so profoundly. It fueled the Industrial Revolution's later stages, enabled affordable global transportation, connected continents through international trade, increased agricultural productivity, supported the chemical industry, expanded access to modern medicine, and helped create supply chains capable of serving billions of people. Petroleum did not build civilization by itself, but it became one of the resources that allowed civilization to reach an unprecedented scale. That success also created a hidden vulnerability. The more efficiently the world was built around abundant, inexpensive oil, the more difficult it became to imagine functioning without it. Perhaps the most revealing lesson is not that oil is irreplaceable. It is that replacing a resource woven into nearly every sector of society requires far more than inventing a new technology. It demands rebuilding infrastructure, redesigning industries, retraining workforces, and reshaping global trade, all while billions of people continue relying on those systems every day. The challenge is therefore not purely scientific or engineering-based. It is logistical, economic, and social on a planetary scale. That is what makes this thought experiment so compelling. The greatest concern is not simply that one day the world may produce less oil than it does today. It is that modern civilization remains far more dependent on petroleum than most of us ever realize, precisely because its influence is usually invisible. Every road, hospital, supermarket, airport, farm, factory, and communication network reflect decades of development built upon a steady flow of oil. Remove that foundation suddenly, and the consequences spread far beyond fuel alone. Which leaves us with one final question. If oil disappeared tomorrow, could our civilization adapt fast enough? Or would the modern world we know begin to unravel?